When Isabella Ferraro arrived at the Grand Palace Hotel in the pouring rain, all she wanted was to surprise her husband Tate. Instead, the hotel staff took one look at her simple clothes and muddy shoes and decided she didn't belong there. They refused to believe someone like her could be married to a billionaire. They sent her away into the stormy night, forcing her to find a cheap motel across town. Little did they know, Tate Blackwood wasn't just any rich man. He was someone who would do anything to protect the woman he loved. And by tomorrow, he would own the very hotel that had turned his wife away. It all started on a day when rain poured from the dark sky as Isabella Ferraro stood outside the Grand Palace Hotel. Water dripped from her long black hair onto her simple blue jacket. Her worn jeans were getting soaked, and her old backpack felt heavy on her tired shoulders. But none of that mattered. She was finally here, ready to surprise Tate after 3 long weeks apart. The Grand Palace Hotel was the fanciest building Isabella Ferraro had ever seen. Bright lights made the white stone walls glow against the night sky. A red carpet ran from the street to the giant glass doors. Men in fancy uniforms stood under the entrance, keeping dry while guests arrived in shiny black cars. Isabella Ferraro took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. Her heart beat fast with excitement, thinking about Tate's face when he saw her a day earlier than planned. She had saved for months to change her flight ticket, wanting to give him this surprise. As she approached the carpet, one of the uniformed men, the doorman, stepped forward. His eyes moved from her face down to her muddy sneakers, then back up to her dripping wet clothes. "Excuse me, miss," he said with a frown. "Service entrance is around the back." Isabella Ferraro blinked in confusion. "I'm not staff. I'm here to see my husband." The doorman raised an eyebrow. His mouth twisted into a small, doubtful smile. "Your husband is staying here? At the Grand Palace?" "Yes," Isabella Ferraro nodded. "He's in room." "I see." The doorman cut her off. He glanced at another man nearby who was watching them. "Why don't you step inside out of the rain, and we'll sort this out?" Isabella Ferraro smiled, relieved. "Thank you." Inside, the hotel lobby took her breath away. The floor was shiny marble that reflected the light from a chandelier bigger than her childhood bedroom. Flowers taller than people grew from giant gold pots. Well-dressed guests sat in plush chairs, sipping from delicate glasses. The doorman led Isabella Ferraro to the front desk where a young woman in a neat black suit looked up. Her smile disappeared when she saw Isabella Ferraro's wet clothes leaving, puddles on the perfect floor. "This woman claims her husband is a guest," the doorman said quietly. The receptionist's eyes narrowed. "I see. Your husband's name, ma'am?" "Tate Blackwood," Isabella Ferraro said, standing taller. She knew how this looked. It wasn't the first time people had judged her before knowing who she was married to. The receptionist's fingers paused over her computer keyboard. Something flashed in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, but it quickly disappeared. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any guest by that name," she said smoothly. Isabella Ferraro frowned. "That can't be right. He's been staying here all week. Please, just call up to his room." "Ma'am, as I've said, we have no guest by that name," the receptionist repeated more firmly. "Perhaps you have the wrong hotel?" "I don't," Isabella Ferraro insisted. She reached for her phone. "I'll call him right now." "There's no need for that," came a sharp male voice. A tall man with gray hair and a perfectly tailored suit approached. He wore a gold name tag that read, "Victor Harmon, Manager." His smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "Is there a problem here, Olivia?" he asked the receptionist. "This woman claims to be married to a guest named Tate Blackwood, Mr. Harmon. I've informed We have no such guest," the receptionist explained. Isabella Ferraro noticed how the manager's eye twitched slightly at Tate's name. He was lying. Her husband was here. "Mr. Harmon," Isabella Ferraro said firmly, "I know my husband is staying here, room 1408. I just want to surprise him." "Ma'am," the manager replied, his voice dripping with fake kindness, "the Grand Palace is fully booked tonight. We have no rooms available, and I can assure you, we have no guest by that name." "I don't need a room," Isabella Ferraro said, her voice rising slightly. "I just need you to—" The manager stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. People like you don't belong in an establishment like the Grand Palace. I suggest you try one of the motels across town, something more suited to your situation." Isabella Ferraro felt like she'd been slapped. Heat rushed to her face as guests nearby turned to stare. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice shaking. "Security!" the manager called, ignoring her question. A large man in a dark suit appeared almost instantly. "Please escort this woman out. She's disturbing our guests," the manager said. "I'm not leaving until I see my husband," Isabella Ferraro said firmly, though tears threatened to spill from her eyes. The security guard took her arm. His grip wasn't painful, but it was firm. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult," he said quietly. Isabella Ferraro looked around. Everyone was staring. Now. Some guests whispered behind their hands. The receptionist smirked. The manager watched with cold eyes, daring her to make a scene. Pride took over. She wouldn't cry here. She wouldn't beg. "Fine," she said, pulling her arm free. "I'll go." The security guard walked her to the door. The rain was coming down, even harder now. Isabella Ferraro stepped out into the downpour without the doorman offering her an umbrella or help getting a taxi. "Don't come back," the security guard muttered before returning inside. Isabella Ferraro stood in the rain, water mixing with the tears now freely flowing down her cheeks. She could call Tate. He would come down immediately, furious at how she'd been treated. The hotel staff would apologize over and over once they realized who she was. But something stopped her. The shock of being treated so badly, the shame of being thrown out like garbage, the painful memory of the manager's words, "People like you." Instead, Isabella Ferraro turned away from the Grand Palace and walked into the rainy night. Her phone showed it was just past 9 p.m. She found a small motel 20 minutes away that had a vacancy sign glowing in the window. The room was small and smelled of old cigarettes, but the lady at the front desk had been kind, offering her a towel to dry off. Isabella Ferraro sat on the bed, staring at her phone, her finger hovering over Tate's number. Not tonight. She couldn't tell him tonight. She needed time to sort through her feelings, to calm down. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow she would find the right words to explain what happened without making him angry. Isabella Ferraro didn't know that across town, in the Grand Palace Hotel's finest suite, Tate Blackwood was trying to call her, wondering why his wife wasn't answering her phone. He had no idea that she was just a few miles away, or that the hotel he'd chosen for his business trip had turned away the person he loved most in the world. And he had no idea what he would do once he found out. Tate Blackwood paced across the polished floor of his hotel suite. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed. He checked his watch again. Almost midnight. He had called Isabella Ferraro 15 times, and still no answer. "Come on, pick up," he muttered as he tried once more. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. He ran a hand through his dark hair in frustration. This wasn't like her. Isabella Ferraro always answered his calls, no matter what. She was supposed to arrive tomorrow, but what if something had happened to her already? His mind filled with terrible possibilities. The room felt too big, too empty without her. Suite 1408 of the Grand Palace was the best room in the hotel. A massive living area, a dining room that could seat 8 people, and a bedroom with the softest king-sized bed money could buy. Right now, it all felt worthless. Tate loosened his tie and tossed it onto the couch. The business meeting had run late, and he'd been excited to come back and talk to Isabella Ferraro about his day. Now worry gnawed at his stomach. Anyone who saw Tate Blackwood at work would hardly recognize him now. In the boardroom, he was feared, cold, calculating. The man who built an empire from nothing and crushed anyone who got in his way. People called him the shark behind his back. But alone, waiting for his wife's call, he was just a man, worried about the woman he loved. His phone rang, and he lunged for it. Not Isabella Ferraro, just his assistant. "Mr. Blackwood, sorry to call so late. The Henderson deal—" "Not now, Marcus," Tate cut him off. "Have you heard from my wife?" "Mrs. Blackwood?" "No, sir. Is everything okay?" "I can't reach her. She's not answering." There was a pause on the line. "I'm sure she's fine, sir. Maybe poor reception where she is? Or her phone battery died?" "Maybe," Tate said, but he didn't believe it. Isabella Ferraro was too careful for that. "Do you want me to make some calls? Check if her flight was delayed?" "No," Tate decided. "Not yet. I'll wait until morning." After hanging up, Tate walked to the window. Rain streamed down the glass, making the city below look like a painting with all the colors running together. Somewhere out there was Isabella Ferraro. He just knew it. His mind drifted to the first time they met, 3 years ago. His private jet had mechanical problems over a remote part of Italy. They'd made an emergency landing near a small village. While his crew worked on repairs, Tate had wandered into the village, annoyed at the delay. That's when he saw her. Isabella Ferraro was helping an old woman carry water from the well. She'd smiled at him, a complete stranger, with such warmth that it stopped him in his tracks. No one smiled at Tate Blackwood like that. People smiled at his money, his power, but not at him. When she noticed he was lost, she'd invited him to her small home for tea. The place had just 2 rooms and a dirt floor, but she'd shared what little food she had without hesitation. She hadn't known who he was, just a foreigner who needed help. For 3 days, while his jet was repaired, Tate stayed in the village. 3 days that changed his life forever. Isabella Ferraro had shown him around, introduced him to everyone, treated him like a normal person. She'd laughed at his jokes, argued with his opinions, and looked at him with honest eyes. He'd fallen in love before his plane was fixed. When he finally told her who he really was, she didn't believe him at first. When she did, it didn't change how she treated him. That's when he knew she was special. 6 months later, they were married. Some called it a fairy tale, the billionaire and the village girl. Others said crueler things. But Tate didn't care what anyone thought. For the first time in his life, he was happy. Isabella Ferraro could have had anything. Designers fighting to dress her, jewels, mansions around the world. But she kept her simple ways. She wore fancy clothes to important events, but preferred her comfortable jeans. She worked with his charities rather than shopping all day like the wives of his business friends, and she made Tate a better man. Less cold, more human. The ringing of his phone jolted him from his memories. "Unknown number," he answered quickly. Hello? Isabella Ferraro? Mr. Blackwood? This is front desk at the Grand Palace. We noticed you ordered room service, but never— Not now, he snapped and hung up. Tate checked the time again. Past midnight. Where was she? He opened his laptop to check her flight details again. Maybe there was a delay he didn't know about. The airline's website showed her flight had landed on, i.e., time, 5 hours ago. A cold feeling settled in his chest. Something was wrong. He tried her phone again. This time, it went straight to voicemail. Her battery had died. Sleep was impossible. Tate spent the night alternating between pacing, calling airlines, and staring at his phone. By morning, dark. Circles had formed under his eyes, and his worry had hardened into something dangerous. The Tate Blackwood the business world feared was back. Someone had better have answers for him, or there would be consequences. At exactly 7 a.m., his phone finally rang. "Tate? It's me!" Isabella Ferraro's voice was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. "Where are you?" he asked, relief washing over him. "I've been worried sick." "I'm at a motel," she said. "The Sleepy Pine, about 20 minutes from downtown." "A motel? Why aren't you at home? I thought your flight wasn't until today." There was a pause. "I wanted to surprise you. I came early." Tate's 2D mind raced. She'd been in the city all night while he worried? Why hadn't she come to the hotel? "Are you okay? Why didn't you come here?" Another pause. "It's a long story. Can you just come get me?" He was already grabbing his keys. "Text me the address. I'll be there in 15 minutes. As Tate hurried out of his luxury suite, he had no idea what had happened to his wife. He didn't know about the cruel words, the humiliation, the rain-soaked walk away from this very hotel. But he was about to find out, and the Grand Palace Hotel would never be the same again. Isabella Ferraro woke to the sound of a vacuum cleaner in the hallway. Sunlight peeked through thin curtains that didn't quite close all the way. For a moment, she wasn't sure where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The rain, the hotel, the cruel words. People like you don't belong in an establishment like the Grand Palace. The memory stung like a fresh cut. Isabella Ferraro sat up on the lumpy motel bed and checked her phone. It had died overnight. She plugged it in and waited for it to power. On. When it did, a flood of notifications appeared. 15 missed calls from Tate. Guilt washed over her. He must have been so worried. But how could she explain what happened? Tate had a temper when it came to people mistreating her. Not with her, never with her. But she'd seen what happened when someone crossed him or someone he cared about. The phone rang in her hand, making her jump. Tate again. She took a deep breath and answered. "Tate? It's me." His relief was clear, even through the phone. They talked briefly, and she gave him the motel address. She didn't explain why she was there instead of at the hotel. That conversation needed to happen face to face. After hanging up, Isabella Ferraro took a quick shower in the tiny bathroom. The water pressure was weak and the towels were thin, but it felt good to be clean. She put on the same clothes from yesterday, her simple jeans and a blue sweater. It was all she had until Tate brought her suitcase from home. Looking in the mirror, Isabella Ferraro wondered what the hotel staff had seen when they looked at her. Just a small Italian woman in ordinary clothes, not someone who belonged in their fancy world. If only they knew she could buy their entire hotel with a single phone call. But that wasn't her way. Isabella Ferraro never flaunted Tate's wealth. It wasn't why she loved him. Money didn't matter in her village. Kindness did. That's what she saw in Tate when they first met. Not his expensive watch or his perfect haircut. but the kindness he tried to hide behind his businessman face. Her. Phone buzzed with a text from Tate. On my way. 10 minutes. Isabella Ferraro gathered her few things and went to wait outside. The morning was bright and clear, so different from the stormy night before. The motel looked even shabbier in daylight. Peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, a neon sign with missing letters. She sat on a bench outside her room, enjoying the warm sun on her face. Meanwhile, across town, Victor Harmon strode through the lobby of the Grand Palace Hotel like a general inspecting his troops. His shoes clicked on the marble floor as staff members straightened their postures when he passed. The flowers in the east corner are wilting. "Replace them!" he barked at a young man who rushed to obey. "That spot on the window is still there," he snapped at a cleaner who immediately began scrubbing harder. Victor reached the front desk where the morning staff was gathered for their daily meeting. Olivia, who had been at the desk last night, looked tired but stood at attention. "Good morning, team," Victor said coldly. "Yesterday's revenue report was acceptable, but we can do better. Remember, the Grand Palace isn't just a hotel. It's an experience for the elite. We maintain standards here." The staff nodded in unison. "Which brings me to my next point," Victor continued. "Last night, Olivia and Carlos properly handled an undesirable situation." He nodded toward Olivia and the security guard standing nearby. A woman tried to talk her way into the hotel, claimed she was married to a guest. Victor chuckled, and some staff members laughed nervously with him. She was clearly not our sort of person, probably trying to scam a free room. "What guest did she claim to be married to?" asked a new receptionist. Victor's smile tightened. "She mentioned Tate Blackwood." A few staff members exchanged glances. Everyone knew that name. "But Mr. Blackwood isn't married, is he?" someone asked. "He is," said a quiet voice from the back. A housekeeper raised her hand timidly. "I've seen photos in magazines. His wife is Italian. Very pretty, but dresses simply." Victor's face darkened. Regardless, the woman last night was clearly an imposter. Mr. Blackwood is one of our most valued guests. He would never marry someone so ordinary. The meeting continued, but Victor's mind was elsewhere. He hadn't actually checked if the woman was telling the truth. He'd assumed she was lying based on her appearance. But what if? No. Impossible. He'd done the right thing. The Grand Palace had standards to maintain. If Tate Blackwood was really married to someone like that woman, Victor would eat his designer tie. The meeting ended, and Victor retreated to his office to review the day's VIP arrivals. His assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, the Henderson party is requesting a late checkout, and the flower arrangement for the Johnson wedding needs your approval." "Fine," Victor waved his hand. "Anything else?" "Just one thing. Mr. Blackwood called down to say he'll be out for a few hours, but wants breakfast prepared in his suite when he returns around 10 a.m. Victor nodded. "Make sure it's perfect. Double. Check everything." When his assistant left, Victor leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a small smile. Tate Blackwood was known as a demanding guest, but his stays were always profitable for the hotel. Large suite, expensive room service, generous tips. The kind of guest Victor approved of. For a moment, the image of the woman from last night flashed in his mind. What if she really was? He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Impossible. He had done the right thing maintaining the hotel's exclusive standards. Besides, even if by some remote chance she was telling the truth, what could happen? At worst, Mr. Blackwood might be annoyed. He'd smooth it over with an upgrade or a complimentary dinner. Victor checked his appearance in a small mirror on his desk. Perfect, as always. He straightened his already straight tie and stood up. Time to make sure everything was running perfectly for another day at the Grand Palace. Little did Victor know that his perfect day was about to become the worst day of his career. And it all started with the sleek black car now pulling up to a rundown motel across town, where Tate Blackwood was about to learn exactly how the Grand Palace had treated his wife. Isabella Ferraro stood as the sleek black car pulled into the motel parking lot. It looked completely out of place among the rusty pickup trucks and old sedans. Heads turned as Tate Blackwood stepped out, his tailored suit probably worth more than what most people staying here earned in a month. But Isabella Ferraro only saw her husband's face, tired, worried, and then flooded with relief when he spotted her. Tate crossed the parking lot in long strides and wrapped her in a tight hug. He smelled like expensive cologne and home. "Are you okay?" he whispered against her hair. "I was so worried." "I'm fine," Isabella Ferraro said, hugging him back just as tightly. She was aware of people watching from their motel room windows and the walkway. A young man with a motorcycle whistled at the expensive car. An older woman hanging laundry outside. Her room stared openly at them. "Let's get you out of here," Tate said, taking her small backpack and guiding her to the car. Inside the luxury vehicle, Isabella Ferraro sank into the soft leather seat. The quiet was instant as the door closed, shutting out the world. Tate started the car, but didn't drive away. Instead, he turned to face her. "What happened? Why didn't you come to the hotel last night?" Isabella Ferraro looked down at her hands. This was the moment. She could make up a story. Say the taxi driver brought her to the wrong place, or that she got confused about which hotel he was staying at. Tate would believe her, but she never lied to him. "I did go to the hotel," she said quietly. Tate's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? If you went to the Grand Palace, why didn't you come up to the room?" "They wouldn't let me in," Isabella Ferraro said, the words feeling small in her mouth. "Wouldn't let you in?" Tate repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Isabella Ferraro still couldn't look up. "They said the hotel was full, that there was no Tate Blackwood staying there. The manager said, people like me don't belong there." She heard Tate's sharp intake of breath. When she finally looked up, his face had changed. The warm, worried husband was gone. In his place was the Tate Blackwood that business rivals feared. Cold eyes, jaw clenched tight. A stillness that meant danger. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who said that to you?" "The manager. His name tag said, Victor Harmon." Tate was quiet for so long that Isabella Ferraro reached for his hand. "It's okay. I'm fine now." "It's not okay," Tate said. His hand squeezed hers gently, but his eyes remained hard. "Did anyone else see this happen?" "Everyone," Isabella Ferraro admitted. "Guests were watching, the receptionist, the doorman, the security guard who walked me out. It was embarrassing." Tate closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he seemed calmer, but Isabella Ferraro knew better. This was Tate at his most dangerous. When the anger went so deep, it became ice instead of fire. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice normal again. "Too normal." "A little," she admitted. "Let's get breakfast," Tate said, putting the car in drive. "I know the best place in the city." Isabella Ferraro tensed. "Where?" "The Grand Palace has an eatery, amazing restaurant," Tate said casually. "The chef makes excellent omelets." "Tate, no," Isabella Ferraro said quickly. "I don't want to go back there." "We won't make a scene," he promised. "We'll just have breakfast. I'm staying there after all." It would be strange not to bring my wife to my hotel. The way he said, "my wife," told Isabella Ferraro everything. Tate was planning something. She'd seen that look before. Right before. He took down a rival company that had tried to steal his business. "Please," she tried again. "Let's just go somewhere else." Tate reached for her hand again, his thumb stroking her palm. Trust me? That was unfair. He knew she always trusted him. "Fine," Isabella Ferraro sighed, "but promise me you won't make a big scene." "I promise I won't raise my voice," Tate said carefully. They both knew that wasn't what she meant, but it was the best she would get. As they drove toward the Grand Palace, Isabella Ferraro felt a knot forming in her stomach. She was wearing the exact same clothes as last night. Her hair was still damp from the shower. "Maybe we should go home first," she suggested. "I can change. You look beautiful." Tate cut her off. "Always." The Grand Palace appeared ahead, even more impressive in daylight. Isabella Ferraro's hands tightened in her lap. "It will be okay," Tate assured her, though his eyes told a different story. As they pulled up to the entrance, Isabella Ferraro saw the same doorman from last night. He rushed forward to open Tate's door, a big smile on his face. Then his eyes met Isabella Ferraro's through the window. The smile froze. His face went pale. And that's when Isabella Ferraro knew that this morning would change everything. The doorman stood frozen beside the car, his hand still on the door handle. Tate stepped out and buttoned his suit jacket with unhurried movements. His face showed nothing but pleasant calm. But Isabella Ferraro knew better. "Good morning, Carlos," Tate said, reading the man's name tag. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." "Wonderful day, sir," the doorman stammered, his eyes darting between Tate and Isabella Ferraro, who was still sitting in the car. "My wife will be joining me for breakfast," Tate continued, his voice pleasant but with an eadoigi edge that made the doorman flinch. "Would you be kind enough to open her door as well?" The doorman rushed around to Isabella Ferraro's side, almost tripping in his hurry. When he opened her door, his face was a mixture of fear and shame. "Good morning, ma'am," he said quietly. "Welcome to the Grand Palace." Such a different greeting from last night. Isabella Ferraro nodded but didn't speak, as she took Tate's offered hand and stepped out of the car. "Thank you, Carlos," Tate said, placing his hand gently on Isabella Ferraro's back. "I believe you've met my wife before?" The doorman's face went from pale to bright red. That is... "No need to answer now," Tate said smoothly. "I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to discuss it later." They walked toward the entrance, where two more staff members rushed to open the grand doors. News seemed to travel fast. These employees already looked nervous, though they hadn't been there last night. The lobby of the Grand Palace was even more beautiful in daylight. Sunlight streamed through massive windows, making the marble floors shine. Well-dressed guests moved about, some heading to breakfast, others checking out. A grand piano played softly in the corner. Isabella Ferraro felt small in her simple clothes. She could feel eyes on her, guests wondering who this ordinary-looking woman was with Tate Blackwood, hotel staff beginning to whisper as they recognized her from last night. At the front desk, the same receptionist from last night was sorting through papers. When she looked up and saw Isabella Ferraro, her eyes widened in shock. Then she noticed Tate, and all color drained from her face. "Good morning, Olivia," Tate said pleasantly, reading her name tag just as he had with the doorman. "I don't believe you've formally met my wife, Isabella Ferraro Blackwood." The receptionist opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. Mr. Blackwood, There seems to have been a misunderstanding last night. Oh? Tate raised an eyebrow. What kind of misunderstanding? Before she could answer, a smooth voice called out from across the lobby. Mr. Blackwood, what a pleasure to see you this morning. Victor Harmon approached with a wide smile that faltered slightly when he recognized Isabella Ferraro. He recovered quickly, his professional mask sliding back into place. And who is this lovely lady? He asked, though his eyes showed he knew exactly who she was. This is my wife, Isabella Ferraro, Tate said, his arm moving protectively around her shoulders. But I believe you two have already met, haven't you, Mr. Harmon? Victor's smile became strained. Have we? I don't recall. Last night, Isabella, Ferraro said quietly. You had security escort me out, in the rain. The lobby seemed to go silent around them. Even the piano player paused. Victor's face paled, but he maintained his professional smile. There must be some mistake, he said smoothly. We would never treat a guest that way, especially not Mrs. Blackwood. Yet, here we are, Tate said, his voice still pleasant but with ice underneath. My wife, soaking wet, sent away from my hotel in the rain, told that people like her don't belong in an establishment like the Grand Palace. Victor swallowed hard. Mr. Blackwood, if there was a misunderstanding, I deeply apologize. We value you as our guest and would never intentionally— We were just heading to breakfast, Tate interrupted. Would you care to join us, Mr. Harmon? We have much to discuss. It wasn't a request. Victor nodded stiffly. Of course. Right this way to our finest table. The restaurant was on the ground floor, with windows overlooking a beautiful garden. Victor led them to a corner table that offered privacy, while still giving a view of the garden. A waitress rushed over immediately. Good morning, Mr. Blackwood, she said with a genuine smile. Your usual coffee? Yes, thank you, Sophia, Tate replied. And tea for my wife. Jasmine, if you have it. Of course, the waitress said, smiling at Isabella Ferraro. Welcome to the Grand Palace, Mrs. Blackwood. Isabella Ferraro smiled back, grateful for the kind greeting. At least not everyone at this hotel was awful. As soon as the waitress left, Victor leaned forward. Mr. Blackwood, I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred. If your wife was treated poorly, I assure you those responsible will be dealt with. Those responsible? Tate repeated softly. That would be you, Mr. Harmon, wouldn't it? Victor shifted uncomfortably. As manager, I take full responsibility, of course, but I'm sure if we review the security footage, we'll see that— Let's, Tate said. Let's review it right now. Victor blinked. I'm sorry? The security footage from last night, Tate said. You have cameras in the lobby, yes? Let's go to your office and watch exactly what happened to my wife. Victor's face had gone from pale to gray. That won't be necessary, Mr. Blackwood. I'm sure Mrs. Blackwood's account is accurate. So you admit to turning away my wife and having her thrown out into the rain? Tate's voice remained calm, but his eyes were dangerous. There were circumstances, Victor stammered. What circumstances? Tate asked. Please, enlighten us. The waitress returned with their drinks, interrupting the tense moment. She set down the tea and coffee, then took out her notepad. Are you ready to order breakfast? She asked. I'll have the eggs Benedict, Tate said without looking at the menu. The same, Isabella Ferraro said quietly. Victor didn't order anything. He looked too sick to eat. After the waitress left, an uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Victor kept looking around as if hoping for rescue. Isabella Ferraro stirred her tea, not making eye contact with anyone. Tate sipped his coffee calmly, watching Victor squirm. "Mr. Blackwood," Victor finally said, his voice low, "I want to make this right. The Grand Palace would be honored to offer you and Mrs. Blackwood a complimentary stay in our presidential suite, along with all meals, and I'm already in the presidential suite," Tate pointed out. "Have been all week." "Of course," Victor nodded quickly. "Then perhaps a full refund for your entire stay," and Tate held up his hand, stopping Victor mid-sentence. "Mr. Harmon, do you know why I chose the Grand Palace for my stay in this city?" Victor straightened slightly. "Because we offer the finest accommodations and service, of course." "That's what I thought too," Tate said. "I've stayed here many times, always been treated well. But now I see that the excellent service I received was because of who I am. Or rather, what I am. Wealthy. Powerful." His eyes hardened. "But my wife, who is neither of those things on her own, was treated like garbage." "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not finished," Tate said quietly, and Victor immediately fell silent. "You see, Mr. Harmon, I believe we reveal our true character not by how we treat the powerful, but by how we treat those we believe have no power." The waitress arrived with their food, placing steaming plates in front of Tate and Isabella Ferraro. The eggs looked perfect, the hollandaise sauce glistening in the morning light. "Will there be anything else?" she asked. "Actually, yes," Tate said. "Could you please ask your general manager to join us? Not Mr. Harmon here, I mean the actual owner of the hotel or their representative." The waitress looked confused. I believe Mr. Sullivan, the hotel owner's representative, is in the building today. I can check if he's available." "Please do," Tate said with a smile. "Tell him it's extremely urgent." As the waitress hurried away, Victor's face went from gray to almost green. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't think that's necessary. I'm authorized to offer any compensation." "It's not about compensation," Tate cut him off. "It's about the fact that I've been doing business with the wrong kind of establishment. I need to fix that." Isabella Ferraro placed her hand gently on Tate's. She could feel the tension in him, tightly controlled. This was just the beginning. Breakfast continued in uncomfortable silence. Isabella Ferraro ate small bites of her eggs. Benedict, while Tate hadn't touched his food. Victor Harmon sat rigidly in his chair, casting nervous glances toward the restaurant entrance. "Your food is getting cold?" Isabella Ferraro said softly to Tate. He gave her a small smile. A real one, not the dangerous smile he'd been giving Victor. "I'm not very hungry." "You should eat," she insisted. "You were up all night worrying." Tate picked up his fork, more to please her than from actual hunger. As he took a bite, the waitress returned with a tall man in an expensive suit. "Mr. Blackwood?" "This is Mr. Sullivan, the representative of Grandeur Hotels International," she said before excusing herself. Sullivan was in his 50s with silver hair and the confident air of someone used to dealing with wealthy clients. He extended his hand to Tate. "Mr. Blackwood, it's an honor to meet you. I understand there's been some sort of issue?" Tate shook his hand briefly. "You could say that. Please, join us." Sullivan sat down, nodding politely to Isabella Ferraro and Victor. "Mrs. Blackwood, I presume? And you already know our manager, Victor." "Unfortunately, yes," Tate said. "Mr. Sullivan, are you aware that your hotel turned my wife away last night? In the rain? Told her, and I quote, 'People like you don't belong in an establishment like the Grand Palace?'" Sullivan's professional smile faltered. He looked at Victor, who seemed to shrink in his chair. "I was not aware of that," Sullivan said carefully. That would be completely unacceptable, of course. Yet it happened, Tate said. My wife had to find a motel across town because your staff decided she didn't look wealthy enough to be my wife. Sullivan's face hardened as he turned to Victor. Is this true? Victor cleared his throat. There was a misunderstanding. The woman, Mrs. Blackwood, didn't have identification. She was soaking wet, dressed very casually. We have protocols for security. Did she ask for me by name? Tate interrupted. Victor nodded reluctantly. Yes, but... And instead of calling, up to my room to verify her story, you had security escort her out? Tate's voice remained calm, but his eyes were cold. Mr. Blackwood, I assure you this is not how we train our staff to behave, Sullivan said quickly. This is completely against our company values. We will launch a full investigation and... Don't bother, Tate cut him off. I know exactly what happened. Your hotel's true values were on display last night. Sullivan's face paled slightly. Everyone in the hotel industry knew Tate Blackwood's influence. One bad review from him could damage their reputation for years. Mr. Blackwood, we will make this right, Sullivan promised. Full refund of your stay, complimentary future accommodations at any of our properties worldwide. I don't want your free rooms, Tate said flatly. A tense silence fell over the table. Isabella Ferraro watched Tate carefully. She knew that. Look, he was calculating something big. The awkward moment was interrupted when a large man in a security uniform approached their table. He stopped short when he saw Isabella Ferraro. You wanted to see me, Mr. Harmon? The guard asked, his eyes darting nervously between Isabella Ferraro and Tate. Victor looked like he wanted to disappear. Not now, Frank. But it was too late. Tate had already noticed the guard's reaction. Actually, please join us, Frank, Tate said, gesturing to an empty chair. You seem to recognize my wife. The security guard stood frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. Frank is the security officer who escorted your wife out last night, Victor admitted reluctantly, perhaps hoping honesty might help the situation. Tate's eyes hardened. I see. Frank remained standing, shifting uncomfortably. Sir, I was just following orders. Mr. Harmon said, Frank, Victor warned. What did Mr. Harmon say? Tate asked, his voice dangerously soft. Frank looked between Victor and Tate, clearly weighing which one was more dangerous to disobey. Tate won. He said to remove her because she was disturbing the other guests, Frank admitted, that she was trying to scam her way into a room by claiming to be married to you. Isabella Ferraro felt her face grow hot with embarrassment as other diners nearby turned to look at their table. And did my wife make a scene? Tate asked. Was she yelling? Threatening anyone? Frank shook his head. No, sir. She was very polite, actually. Just kept insisting she was your wife. Because she is. My wife, Tate said flatly. Sullivan cut in. Mr. Blackwood, this is clearly a terrible misjudgment on our part. I promise you that I'd like to speak with my wife alone for a moment, Tate interrupted, standing up. Frank, Mr. Harmon, Mr. Sullivan, please wait here. No one dared object. Tate guided Isabella Ferraro to a quiet corner of the restaurant, near a large potted plant that offered some privacy. Are you okay? He asked softly, his hand gentle on her arm. Isabella Ferraro nodded. I'm fine. But Tate, everyone is staring. Let them, he said. I don't care what they think. What are you planning? She asked, knowing him too well to believe this confrontation was the end of it. Tate's eyes softened as he looked at her. Do you trust me? Always, she said without hesitation. "Then wait for me in the car," he said, handing her the keys. "I need about 10 minutes to make some calls." Isabella Ferraro wanted to ask more questions, but she knew that look. Tate had made up his mind about something big. "Don't do anything crazy," she pleaded. His smile was both loving and fierce. "Define crazy." With a sigh, Isabella Ferraro took the keys. She knew there was no talking him out of whatever he had planned. As they walked back to the table, Isabella Ferraro noticed that Frank, Victor, and Sullivan were all sitting rigidly, like schoolboys waiting for the principal. "Gentlemen," Tate announced, "my wife will be waiting for me in the car. I have some business calls to make, and then we will continue our discussion." Victor looked relieved, probably hoping this meant Tate was calming down. Sullivan stood up, still trying to salvage the situation. "Mr. Blackwood, please know that we are prepared to take immediate action. Mr. Harmon will be placed on administrative leave while we investigate." "That won't be necessary just yet," Tate said. "I'll be back shortly." As Isabella Ferraro walked through the lobby, she could feel eyes following her. Staff members who had heard about last night, guests curious about the beautiful woman in simple clothes who had the famous Tate Blackwood wrapped around her finger. Outside, the doorman, Carlos, rushed to help her into the car. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said quietly as he opened the door, "I'm truly sorry about last night. I was just following orders, but I should have—" "It's okay," Isabella Ferraro said, though it wasn't really. "We all make mistakes." "Is Mr. Blackwood very angry?" Carlos asked, fear evident in his voice. Isabella Ferraro thought about the cold calculation she'd seen in Tate's eyes. "He's not angry," she said truthfully. "And that's what should worry you?" Carlos looked confused as she got into the car. "Isabella," Ferraro watched through the windshield as he returned to his post, looking nervous. She knew what was coming. When Tate got quiet like this, when he stopped showing anger and started making calls, that's when his business opponents usually realized they'd made a terrible mistake. The Grand Palace Hotel had no idea what was about to hit them. Tate. Blackwood strode through the hotel lobby, phone pressed to his ear. His face revealed nothing as hotel staff scrambled out of his way. "Marcus, I need you to clear my schedule for today," he said to his assistant. "All of it. Tell Henderson we'll reschedule the contract signing." He paused by a large marble column, listening to his assistant's response. "Yes, it's that important," Tate continued. "And I need you to contact our legal team. Have them prepare acquisition documents for a hotel purchase, immediately." Another pause. The Grand Palace Hotel, here in the city. Yes, the whole thing. Tate ended the call and made another, this one to his financial team. As he waited for an answer, he watched Victor Harmon and Mr. Sullivan talking in hushed, urgent tones across the lobby. They kept glancing nervously in his direction. Good. Let them worry. 20 minutes later, Tate walked into the hotel's main conference room, where Victor, Sullivan, and 3 other executives now waited anxiously. The room was impressive. A long mahogany table, plush leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city. On any other day, Tate would have appreciated the luxury. Today, he barely noticed it. "Gentlemen," Tate said coolly, as he took a seat at the head of the table. "Thank you for making yourselves available on such short notice." Sullivan cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, we want to assure you that we're taking this incident very seriously. We've already begun." Tate held up his hand, silencing the man mid-sentence. "I'm not here to discuss apologies or free hotel stays." The room fell quiet. Tate placed his phone on the table and sat back in his chair. For a long moment, he said nothing. just studied each face around the table. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, when the tension was almost unbearable, Tate asked quietly, "How much?" The executives exchanged confused glances. "How much?" "Compensation would you consider fair?" Sullivan asked carefully. "No." Tate shook his head. "How much for the hotel?" A nervous laugh escaped one of the executives. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. The hotel isn't for sale." "Everything is for sale," Tate replied calmly. "It's just a question of price." Sullivan leaned forward, his business instincts kicking in despite the strange situation. "Mr. Blackwood, while we appreciate your interest, the Grand Palace is one of the flagship properties in the Grandeur Hotel's international portfolio. It's not something we're looking to divest." "Double its market value," Tate said, as if Sullivan hadn't spoken. "Cash deal, closed by the end of the week." The room went completely silent. The executives stared at Tate, then at each other. "Mr. Blackwood," Sullivan said slowly, "I understand you're upset about what happened to your wife, but surely this is an overreaction." "Triple its market value if we close by tomorrow," Tate countered, his expression unchanged. Victor Harmon's mouth actually fell open. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious, Mr. Harmon," Tate said, his eyes cold. "Ask anyone in business who knows me. I don't make jokes about money." One of the younger executives whispered urgently to Sullivan, who frowned and shook his head. "Mr. Blackwood," Sullivan tried again, "even if we wanted to sell, which we don't, I don't have the authority to make that decision. Only the CEO and board could approve something of this magnitude." Tate checked his watch. "Who's your CEO? Jonathan Winters, correct?" Sullivan nodded, surprised. "Yes, but—" "And your board chair is Elizabeth Chen," Tate continued. "It wasn't a question." "How did you know that?" another executive asked. Tate ignored the question and picked up his phone. He pressed a single button and put it on speaker. "Marcus, connect me with Jonathan Winters at Grandeur Hotels." The executives exchanged alarmed glances. Sullivan leaned forward, his professional composure cracking. "Mr. Blackwood, you can't just call our CEO directly. There are channels, protocols." "Jonathan!" "Tate Blackwood here," Tate said into the phone, ignoring Sullivan completely. "I'm sitting in the conference room of your Grand Palace Hotel with some of your executives." A deep voice came through the speaker. "Tate? This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" "I want to buy the Grand Palace. Your team here says they don't have the authority to sell. I figured I'd go straight to the top." There was a pause on the line. "You want to buy one of our flagship hotels? Where is this coming? From Tate?" "Let's just say I had an enlightening experience with your customer service," Tate replied. "I've offered 3 times market value, cash deal, closed by tomorrow." Another long pause. "That's a very generous offer." "It's a one-day offer, Jonathan," Tate said. "I can have the paperwork ready within the hour. You can put it before your board this afternoon." Sullivan was frantically writing notes and sliding them to the other executives. Victor Harmon looked like he might be sick. "Tate, we've known each other for years," Jonathan said carefully. "This isn't like you. What really happened?" "Your staff threw my wife out of the hotel last night because she didn't look wealthy enough to be married to me," Tate said bluntly. "Left her in the rain to find her own accommodations across town." "What?" Jonathan sounded genuinely shocked. "That's completely unacceptable. I assure you, whoever is responsible will be—" "I'm not interested in seeing people fired, Jonathan," Tate interrupted. "I'm interested in buying the hotel. Today." There was muffled conversation on the other end of the line, as if Jonathan had covered the phone to speak with someone. "I'll need to consult with the board," Jonathan finally said. "Can I call you? Back within the hour?" "I'll be here," Tate replied, and ended the call. The silence in the conference room was deafening. Sullivan looked shell-shocked. The other executives were whispering urgently to each other. Victor Harmon sat completely still, his face pale. "You can't just buy a hotel because you're angry," Victor finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tate raised an eyebrow. "Watch me!" Sullivan stood up suddenly. "I need to make some calls. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Blackwood." Tate nodded, and Sullivan hurried out of the room, followed quickly by the other executives. Only Victor remained, looking lost. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Tate studied the man for a moment. "Because you showed me something important last night, Mr. Harmon." "What?" "That this hotel may look beautiful," Tate said, gesturing to the luxurious room around them. "But at its core, it's ugly. And I fix ugly things." Victor's phone buzzed. He looked at it and his face went even paler. Without another word, he hurried out of the room. Tate sat alone at the conference table, calm and collected. Outside the windows, life in the city continued as normal. But inside the Grand Palace, nothing would ever be the same again. In the quiet of Tate's car, Isabella Ferraro leaned her head against the cool window. The busy street outside was filled with people who had no idea of the drama unfolding inside the Grand Palace. She closed her eyes, and memories of her past washed over her. She remembered her village. Small houses clustered together on the side of a mountain, surrounded by green rice fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Life there had been simple, but happy. Her family's home had just 3 rooms, with a roof that leaked during heavy monsoon rains. But it had been filled with love and laughter. Isabella Ferraro had never owned fancy clothes or expensive jewelry. Her parents had taught her that a person's worth came from their heart, not their wallet. "Be kind," her mother always said. "Kindness costs nothing but means everything." When her father got sick, Isabella Ferraro had worked 2 jobs to help pay for medicine. She'd rise before dawn to help at the local market, then spend evenings serving food at a small restaurant that tourists sometimes visited. The work was hard, but she never complained. This was what family did for each other. Then came the day the handsome stranger landed near their village. The whole community had been buzzing with excitement about the private plane. Some said it belonged to a movie star, others thought it might be a government official. Isabella Ferraro had been walking home from work when she saw him. Tall, clearly foreign, looking frustrated as he tried to ask directions from an old man who spoke no English. Without thinking twice, she had approached to help. "Are you lost?" she had asked in English, surprising the stranger. His relief had been immediate. "Yes, thank God someone speaks English. My plane had mechanical problems. We landed on the old airstrip outside town. I need to find somewhere to stay while repairs are made." The nearest hotel was in the city, a 3-hour drive away. Without hesitation, Isabella Ferraro had offered the stranger their spare room, the one her grandmother had used before she passed away. "It's very simple," she had warned him. "Nothing like what you're probably used to." He had smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes. "At this point, I'd sleep on hay. Thank you." That night, she'd cooked a simple meal of rice and vegetables. The stranger, who introduced himself only as Tate, had eaten everything, praising her cooking. He'd been polite, helping her wash dishes afterward despite her protests. For 3 days, Tate stayed with her family. He chopped firewood for her mother, played chess with her father, and even helped fix their leaky roof. Not once did he complain about the hard bed or the lack of hot water. On the 2nd day, he'd joined her on her walk to work. She remembered how he'd asked endless questions about her life, her dreams, her family. No one had ever been so interested in her thoughts before. "Why do you work 2 jobs?" he'd asked. "My father needs medicine," she had explained simply. "And my brother should stay in school." Tate had gone quiet then. The next morning, her father's medicine, usually so expensive they could only afford half doses, had mysteriously been paid for in full at the village clinic. When she confronted Tate, he'd denied any involvement, but his eyes gave him away. On the 3rd day, he had asked her to show him the mountain trail behind the village. They'd hiked for hours, talking about everything and nothing. At the top, overlooking the valley below, he'd suddenly asked if she'd ever left her village. "Only to go to the city for school supplies," she had admitted. "But someday, I want to see the ocean." "I have houses by the ocean," he'd said quietly. 3 of them, she had laughed, thinking he was joking. "And I have a palace on the moon." His face had turned serious. "Isabella Ferraro, there's something I need to tell you about who I really am." That was when everything changed. He wasn't just Tate. He was Tate Blackwood, billionaire businessman. The private jet wasn't borrowed. It was one of many he owned. The work calls he'd been making were to manage a global empire. She hadn't believed him at first. How could this kind man who ate simple food at her table and fixed their roof be one of the richest people in the world? It made no sense. To prove it, he'd shown her news articles about himself on his phone. She remembered how her hands had trembled when she finally understood. This man could buy her entire village 1,000 times over. "Are you angry I didn't tell you sooner?" he had asked, looking worried for the first time since she'd met him. "No," she had answered truthfully. "But I'm sad you'll be leaving tomorrow, when your plane is fixed." His eyes had lit up. "Come with me." "Where?" "Anywhere." "Everywhere," he'd said. "I want to show you the ocean, all of them. Pacific, Atlantic, Indian." She had laughed again, but this time with tears in her eyes. "People like me don't just run off with billionaires, Tate." "Why not?" he had asked simply. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The memory made Isabella Ferraro smile now as she sat in Tate's expensive car. How scared she had been to leave everything she knew behind. How her parents had worried, even though they liked Tate. Her brother had been the one to convince her. "If you don't go," he'd said, "you'll always wonder what might have happened. Besides, if he turns out to be a jerk, you can always come home." But Tate had never been a jerk. He had kept every promise. Showed her not just the ocean, but the entire world. Treated her with respect. Introduced her to his business friends without ever expecting her to change who she was. And when they married 6 months later, he had insisted on having the ceremony in her village, with every tradition honored. He had knelt before her parents, asking properly for their blessing in their own language, which he had secretly been learning. A soft knock on the car window pulled Isabella Ferraro from her memories. She looked up to see Tate standing there, a small smile on his face. She unlocked the door. "Is it done?" she asked, as he slid into the driver's seat. Tate nodded. "Almost. The CEO is calling me back within the hour." "You're really going to buy this hotel because they were mean to me?" His eyes softened as he looked at her. "I'm buying this hotel because they showed me it needs new leadership. But yes, the way they treated you was the final straw." Isabella Ferraro shook her head, still not quite believing it. "Sometimes I forget who you are in the business world." "Good," Tate said, taking her hand, "because that's not who I really am. The real me is the man you met in your village." She squeezed his hand, knowing it was true. No matter how many hotels he bought or companies he ran, Tate Blackwood was still the man who had fixed her family's roof and fallen in love with a simple village girl. Tate's phone rang, breaking the quiet moment between them. He checked the screen and gave Isabella Ferraro a small nod before answering. "Jonathan, that was quick," he said, putting the call on speaker. "Tate, I've spoken with the board." Jonathan Winters' voice filled the car. "They're intrigued by your offer." "Intrigued isn't the same as accepting," Tate replied calmly. There was a pause. "The board has concerns about your motivations. They worry this is an emotional reaction that you might regret." Tate glanced at Isabella Ferraro. "My motivations are my business, Jonathan. My offer stands, triple market value, but only if we close by tomorrow." "That timeline is nearly impossible," Jonathan protested. "The paperwork alone, my legal team is already preparing everything," Tate cut in. "I've also spoken with my bank. The funds can be transferred as soon as the papers are signed." Another pause, longer this time. Isabella Ferraro could almost picture the CEO on the other end, weighing options, calculating risks and benefits. "The board would like to counter," Jonathan finally said. "We'll sell, but we want 3 things. First, we keep the Grandeur Hotel's management contract for 6 months to ensure a smooth transition." Tate frowned. 2 months, and I choose which staff members stay during that period?" "Acceptable," Jonathan conceded after a moment. "Second, we want the right to convert the property into a branded partnership if you ever decide to sell." "Fine, as long as I have the right to decline any potential buyer," Tate countered. "What's the third condition?" "We want to know why," Jonathan said simply. "Not for the paperwork, just between us. I've known you for years, Tate. You don't make business decisions based on personal grudges. What's really going on here?" Tate looked at Isabella Ferraro, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to share. "Your hotel has a toxic culture, Jonathan," Tate said. "The way they treated my wife is just a symptom of a deeper problem. I've stayed at the Grand Palace many times and been treated like royalty. But the moment someone unimportant walks through those doors, the true character of the place shows itself." "I see," Jonathan said quietly. "I'm not buying it just because I'm angry," Tate continued. "I'm buying it because it needs to change, and I have the means to make that happen." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "The board accepts." "Your terms," Jonathan finally said. "Our legal team will review your documents as soon as they arrive. But Tate, for what it's worth, I'm truly sorry about what happened to your wife. That's not the company we try to be." "Maybe not," Tate replied. "But it's the company you became when no one was watching." After a few more details were discussed, Tate ended the call. He sat quietly for a moment, then turned to Isabella Ferraro. "Ari, you sure about this?" she asked. "It's a lot of money, Tate," he smiled. "It's just money. Some things are more important." Isabella Ferraro knew there was no talking him out of it now. When Tate believed something was right, nothing could change. "His mind? What happens next?" she asked. "Now we go back inside," Tate said, opening his car door. "I have a meeting to finish." When Tate and Isabella Ferraro walked back into the hotel, the atmosphere had completely changed. Staff members who had been whispering frantically fell silent. The front desk clerk stood straighter. Even the doorman, Carlos, seemed to be holding his breath as they passed. News traveled fast in a hotel. Sullivan was waiting for them in the lobby, looking both nervous and impressed. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted them, actually bowing slightly. "I've just spoken with Mr. Winters. He informed me of the situation." "Good," Tate said. "Then you know we have work to do. Is the conference room still available?" "Of course, sir." Right this way." Sullivan led them back to the conference room, where a group of people now waited. Victor Harmon sat at one end of the table, looking like he hadn't moved since Tate left. Several hotel executives were huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, and 3 new faces, sharp-looking men and women in business suits with leather portfolios, sat ready with pens in hand. "Your legal team arrived about 10 minutes ago," Sullivan explained. Tate nodded. "Let's get started then." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Papers were passed back and forth. Phone calls were made. Numbers were discussed in calm, professional voices that hid the shocking nature of what was happening. One of the world's most famous luxury hotels was changing hands over a single incident, all because a woman in simple clothes had been judged by her appearance. Isabella Ferraro sat quietly beside Tate, watching it all unfold. Most of the business talk went over her head, but she understood enough. By the end of the day, Tate would own this hotel. All because of her. Part of her felt guilty about the amount of money Tate was spending. Another part felt a small, secret satisfaction when she caught Victor glancing at her nervously. But mostly, she felt proud of her husband, not because of his wealth or power, but because of the principles he stood for. Hours passed. More people joined the meeting. Lunch was served, though few ate much. By late afternoon, the stack of papers had grown thick, and most had Tate's signature at the bottom. Finally, after what seemed like an endless procession of documents, Tate signed the last page with a flourish. "Congratulations, Mr. Blackwood," one of his lawyers said. "You are now the owner of the Grand Palace Hotel." A strange hush fell over the room. It was done. What had started with a woman being turned away in the rain had ended with that same woman's husband buying the entire building. Sullivan cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, on behalf of Grandeur Hotels, I want to officially welcome you to the hospitality industry. I'm sure the transition period will—" "Thank you," Tate cut him off politely, "but I believe there are some immediate changes I'd like to discuss." Everyone at the table tensed. Victor Harmon looked like he might faint. "Of course," Sullivan nodded quickly. "Anything you wish." Tate turned to the room at large. "The Grand Palace will continue to operate as normal for now, with one exception." All eyes were on him, waiting. "There will be new management," Tate said calmly, his eyes finding Victor Harmon's across the table. Victor swallowed hard, his future hanging in the balance. Isabella Ferraro held her breath, wondering what Tate would do next. Tate stood and buttoned his suit jacket, a move Isabella Ferraro recognized as his way of taking command of a room. "Mr. Harmon," Tate said, his voice even, "we'll discuss your future with the hotel tomorrow morning. For now, continue your duties as normal." Victor's face showed a mix of relief and confusion. He'd clearly been expecting to be fired on the spot. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," he stammered. "Don't thank me yet," Tate replied. "Now, if you'll all excuse us, my wife and I would like to check into our room." Sullivan jumped to his feet. "Of course! We've prepared the presidential suite for both of you. Your luggage has already been moved from your previous room, Mr. Blackwood." "Perfect," Tate said, offering his hand to Isabella Ferraro. As they walked out of the conference room, Isabella Ferraro could feel everyone's eyes on them. Word had spread throughout the hotel. The staff lined the hallway, watching with a mixture of curiosity and fear as the new owner passed by. "Everyone's staring," Isabella Ferraro whispered. "Let them," Tate replied quietly. "Things are going to change around here, starting with how they look at people." At the front desk, a nervous young woman handed them a new key card. "The presidential suite is ready, Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood. Please let us know if you need anything at all." The elevator ride was silent. Isabella Ferraro could feel the tension slowly leaving Tate's body as they moved away from the crowd below. When the doors opened directly into the suite, she gasped. The presidential suite was bigger than their first apartment together. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a stunning view of the city skyline. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases, and a fruit basket waited on a marble counter. Through an open door, she could see an enormous bed covered in plush white linens. "This is excessive," Isabella Ferraro said, walking slowly into the room. Tate smiled. "Welcome to the hotel business." Just as they were settling in, a knock came at the door. Tate opened it to find Victor Harmon standing there with an ice bucket containing a bottle of expensive champagne. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," Victor said with a strained smile. "A small token to welcome you properly to the Grand Palace." His eyes flicked to Isabella Ferraro, and she could see the effort it took for him to look directly at her now. This was the same man who had her thrown out just yesterday, now bowing and scraping. "Thank you, Mr. Harmon," Tate said coolly. "You can leave it on the table." Victor carefully placed the champagne down and turned to Isabella Ferraro. "Mrs. Blackwood, I want to personally apologize for the misunderstanding last night. It was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility." His words sounded rehearsed, his smile fake. Isabella Ferraro nodded but said nothing. This wasn't a real apology, just a desperate attempt to save his job. After Victor left, Isabella Ferraro sank onto the plush sofa. "He's only sorry because you bought the hotel." "Of course," Tate agreed, sitting beside her. "People like that don't change overnight." "What are you going to do with him?" she asked. Tate's eyes softened as he looked at her. "What do you think I should do?" Isabella Ferraro considered the question carefully. Part of her wanted to see Victor fired, to feel the same helplessness she had felt in the rain, but she remembered her mother's words. Kindness costs nothing but means everything. "I don't know," she admitted. "He was cruel, but I don't want anyone to lose their job because of me." Tate smiled. "And that's why I love you. Most people would want revenge." "What will you do with the hotel?" she asked, changing the subject. Tate leaned back on the sofa. "I have some ideas, but first, I need to understand how it's run, what's working, what isn't. And you're going to run a hotel now, with all your other businesses?" "I'll hire people for the day-to-day operations," Tate explained. "Good people who understand that luxury doesn't mean exclusivity." Isabella Ferraro nodded, though it still felt surreal. Yesterday, she'd been turned away from this very hotel. Today, she was sitting in its most expensive suite as the owner's wife. Later that evening, after a quiet room service dinner, served by staff who couldn't stop staring at Isabella Ferraro, Tate stepped onto the balcony to make some calls. Isabella Ferraro walked around the suite, touching the expensive furniture, looking at the art on the walls. On a small desk, she found a hotel brochure. The cover showed the grand entrance where she had stood in the rain. Inside were photos of smiling staff members welcoming guests, beautiful rooms, and elegant dining areas. One line stood out: "The Grand Palace Hotel, where every guest is treated like royalty." Isabella Ferraro laughed softly at the irony. Tate came back inside, slipping his phone into his pocket. "What's funny?" She showed him the brochure. Not every guest, apparently. Tate took the glossy paper, reading the line she pointed to. His face grew serious. "This is exactly what needs to change, Isabella. Not just the words, but the meaning behind them." "Can you really change how people think?" she asked. "I can change what's acceptable behavior, Tate replied. The thinking might take longer, but it has to start somewhere. He sat beside her on the edge of the massive bed. I know this seems extreme, buying an entire hotel, but when I saw the way they treated you, something broke inside me. Isabella Ferraro leaned against his shoulder. I understand. I just hope this doesn't cause problems for your other business deals. Let me worry about that, Tate said, kissing the top of her head. As they got ready for bed, Isabella Ferraro couldn't help but think about the strange turn her life had taken. From a small village girl to the wife of a man who bought a luxury hotel because someone had been unkind to her. Tate, she said, as they lay in the darkness. Did you always plan to buy this hotel? Even before what happened to me? There was a long pause before he answered. Get some sleep, Isabella. Tomorrow is going to be a busy day. His non-answer made her wonder. Was there more to this story than she knew? Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the presidential suite. Isabella Ferraro opened her eyes to find Tate already awake, dressed in a crisp suit, reading something on his tablet. How long have you been up? She asked, sitting up in the enormous bed. A couple of hours, Tate replied, setting his tablet aside. I have a staff meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. Isabella Ferraro glanced at the bedside clock. 8:15. That's soon. I ordered breakfast, Tate said, nodding toward a covered tray on the dining table. And I had your suitcase brought from home. Your clothes are in the closet. She smiled at his thoughtfulness. Even with a hotel to run and meetings to attend, he still made sure she was taken care of. After a quick shower, Isabella Ferraro, dressed in a simple blue dress, nicer than her clothes from yesterday, but still modest compared to what most wealthy women wore. She found Tate in the living area reviewing notes. Nervous? She asked, pouring herself a cup of tea from the breakfast tray. About the meeting? No, Tate said, but I do want you to be there. Isabella Ferraro nearly spilled her tea. Me? Why? Because you're part of this, Tate explained. What happened to you is the reason changes are coming. I want them to see you as more than just the woman who was turned away. Isabella Ferraro wasn't sure about this plan. She didn't like being the center of attention. But the determined look in Tate's eyes told her this was important to him. Okay, she agreed, but I won't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Tate assured her. Just be there. At precisely 9 a.m., Tate and Isabella Ferraro walked into the Grand Palace's largest conference room. Every department head was present, along with key staff members. Victor Harmon sat rigidly at one end of the table, his face a careful mask. When Isabella Ferraro entered the room with Tate, a hush fell over the gathered employees. Good morning, Tate said, taking his place at the head of the table. Isabella Ferraro sat beside him, feeling dozens of eyes on her. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. The room was silent, everyone waiting to see what the new owner would do. Many looked nervous, probably fearing mass firings. As you know, I purchased the Grand Palace yesterday, Tate continued. This was not a planned acquisition, but sometimes opportunities present themselves in unexpected ways. He glanced at Isabella Ferraro before continuing. I want to be clear about something from the start. This hotel will maintain its luxury status. We will still offer the finest accommodations, the best service, the most exquisite dining experiences. What will change is who we consider worthy of that service. Confused looks passed between staff members. Let me introduce someone, Tate said, gesturing to Isabella Ferraro. This is my wife, Isabella Ferraro Blackwood. 2 nights ago, she came to this hotel to surprise me. She was tired from her flight, caught in the rain, and dressed in simple clothes. And because of how she looked, she was turned away, humiliated, and left to find shelter elsewhere in a city she didn't know well. Gasps came from some staff who hadn't heard the full story. Victor Harmon stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The Grand Palace has been operating under a toxic idea, Tate continued, his voice firm but not angry. The idea that a person's worth can be determined by their appearance, their clothes, or their perceived wealth. That ends today. He stood and walked around the table slowly. I grew up poor. Did any of you know that? Before I built my companies, before I made my first million, I was just a kid from a working-class family who sometimes didn't have enough to eat. This revelation seemed to surprise many in the room. Isabella Ferraro watched their faces, some disbelieving, others curious. My wife grew up in a small village, Tate continued. She worked hard her entire life, supporting her family, never having luxuries. When I met her, she shared what little she had with me, a complete stranger, without hesitation. She is the most generous, kind person I know. Yet when she came to this hotel, she was judged as unworthy based solely on her appearance. The room was completely silent now. Some staff members looked ashamed. Starting today, the Grand Palace will maintain its luxury but eliminate its exclusivity based on appearances, Tate announced. Every guest who can pay for a room deserves the same excellent service, regardless of what they're wearing or how they look. He returned to his seat next to Isabella Ferraro. Now, there will be organizational changes, which my team will discuss with each department. But before that, I'd like my wife to say a few words. Isabella Ferraro froze. This wasn't part of the plan. She looked at Tate in panic, but he nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she stood. I don't have a prepared speech, she began hesitantly. I'm not used to speaking to groups. The room waited patiently, all eyes on her. In my village, we have a saying, "Judge the tree by its fruit, not its bark." Isabella Ferraro continued, gaining confidence. It means what matters is how someone behaves, not how they look. When I was turned away from this hotel, it hurt. Not because I couldn't see my husband, but because I was judged as less than human. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of various staff members. I don't want anyone fired because of what happened to me. People make mistakes. What matters is learning from them. I believe everyone deserves a second chance. From the back of the room, Isabella Ferraro noticed a housekeeper wiping away a tear. Several others looked moved by her words. All I ask is that you treat every guest with dignity, Isabella Ferraro concluded. Rich or poor, fancy clothes or simple ones. Everyone deserves respect. She sat down, her heart pounding. Tate squeezed her hand under the table, pride evident in his eyes. Thank you, Isabella Ferraro, he said, addressing the room again. My wife's compassion is why there won't be mass firings today, as some of you might have feared. Relief visibly swept through the room. At the end of the table, Victor's, Harmon let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the meeting began. However, Tate continued, there will be one significant staffing change. All eyes turned to Victor, who seemed to brace himself. Mr. Victor Harmon will be reassigned, Tate announced, effective immediately. Victor's face went pale, but he nodded stiffly, accepting what he assumed would be a humiliating demotion or transfer. What Tate said next surprised everyone in the room, especially Victor himself. Mr. Harmon will be taking on a new role in our maintenance department, Tate announced. For the next 6 months, He will work alongside our housekeeping and maintenance teams, learning every aspect of what it takes to keep this hotel running from the ground up. Victor's mouth fell open. Maintenance? But I'm the manager. We're the manager, Tate corrected him calmly. Your new position begins today. Report to Mr. Garcia in maintenance after this meeting. He'll provide your uniform and schedule. A man at the far end of the table, presumably Mr. Garcia, looked as shocked as everyone else, but nodded professionally. This isn't a punishment, Tate continued, addressing the entire room now. It's an education. Sometimes we need to walk in other people's shoes to truly understand their experience. The meeting continued with introductions to Tate's team members, who would be overseeing the transition. New training programs were announced, focusing on treating all guests with equal respect. By the time the meeting ended, the mood had shifted from fear to cautious optimism. As people filed out, Victor remained seated, looking stunned. When the room had emptied except for Tate, Isabella Ferraro, and himself, he finally spoke. "You could have fired me," he said quietly. "Why didn't you?" Tate studied him for a moment. "Firing you would be easy. Teaching you would be more valuable. I don't need to clean toilets to learn a lesson," Victor said stiffly. "Yes, you do," Tate replied. "Every job in this hotel matters. Every person matters. That's something you've forgotten." Victor opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Finally, he stood and straightened his expensive tie one last time. "I'll report to maintenance," he said, his voice resigned. After he left, Isabella Ferraro turned to Tate. "Do you think he'll actually learn anything?" "Maybe," Tate shrugged. "Maybe not. But everyone else will learn something by seeing him do the work he considered beneath him." 1 month later, the Grand Palace Hotel had transformed. New signs in the lobby read, "Welcome all travelers." Staff wore pins saying, "Dignity and respect for every guest." Training sessions happened weekly, teaching employees to focus on behavior, not appearances. Victor Harmon, now dressed in a maintenance uniform, could be seen fixing leaky faucets and replacing light bulbs. At first, he had done the work grudgingly, but recently, Isabella Ferraro had noticed him actually helping guests who looked lost. Regardless of how they were dressed, Tate had hired a new manager, a woman who had worked her way up from housekeeping at another hotel. She brought a completely different perspective to the job, implementing changes that improved conditions for both guests and staff. The most surprising change was Isabella Ferraro's involvement. Tate had asked her to oversee a new training program about cultural sensitivity and respect. At first, she had been hesitant, but she found she enjoyed sharing her perspective with the staff. One afternoon, Tate called Isabella Ferraro to his office in the hotel. When she arrived, he was reviewing some documents with his assistant. "There you are," he said, smiling as she entered. "I have something to show you." He handed her a folder. Inside was a proposal for something called the Open Door Foundation. "What is this?" she asked, scanning the pages. "Remember how you had to stay at that motel across town?" Tate explained. "It got me thinking about travelers who can't afford luxury hotels but deserve safe, clean places to stay." Isabella Ferraro read further. The foundation would permanently reserve 10 rooms at the Grand Palace for travelers in need, people with medical emergencies, families visiting sick relatives, or others with urgent needs but limited funds. These rooms would be free? She asked, amazed. "Completely free," Tate confirmed. "And I want the foundation to be in your name. You'll choose who gets the rooms." Tears filled Isabella Ferraro's eyes. This was the kind of generosity she had always dreamed of being able to offer. "It's perfect," she whispered. Tate took her hand. "There's something else I need to tell you." His serious tone made her look up. "What is it?" Tate sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she knew meant he was uncomfortable. I wasn't completely honest with you about why I bought this hotel. What do you mean? The night you were turned away wasn't the first time the Grand Palace treated someone badly, Tate explained. I've been hearing rumors about this place for months. Staff mistreated, guests disrespected if they weren't wealthy enough, complaints ignored. Isabella Ferraro listened, confused. So you already knew about the hotel's problems? Tate nodded. My company has been researching hotel chains for potential acquisition. Grandeur Hotels was on our list because of these issues. The company had good properties, but terrible management culture. You were already planning to buy it? Isabella Ferraro asked, understanding dawning. I was considering it, Tate admitted, but I needed a reason that wouldn't alert my competitors to my interest in the hotel industry. When they mistreated you, it gave me the perfect cover. Everyone would think I bought it out of anger or revenge. So you used what happened to me as an excuse? Isabella Ferraro wasn't sure how to feel about this. Not an excuse, Tate said quickly. A catalyst. What happened to you was real, and it made me more determined than ever to change this place. But yes, I had been planning to move into the hotel business before that night. Isabella Ferraro was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. Part of her felt strange, knowing there was a business strategy behind what she'd thought was just Tate defending her honor. But another part understood. This was the businessman side of her husband, the side that thought 10 steps ahead. Are you angry? Tate asked, watching her carefully. Isabella Ferraro shook her head slowly. No, but next time, just tell me your plans. I'm your wife, not just part of your business strategy. You're right, Tate said, taking her hands. I should have told you everything from the beginning. So what happens now? Isabella Ferraro asked. Are you going to buy more hotels? Tate smiled. Actually, yes, but only ones that need fixing. And for each one, we'll set up another foundation like yours. Isabella Ferraro smiled, thinking of all the people they could help. From a simple village girl to someone who could make real changes in the world. Life had taken her on an incredible journey. The poor village girl and the billionaire, she mused aloud. Creating something beautiful out of an ugly situation, Tate finished, pulling her close. And in that moment, surrounded by the luxury of a hotel that had once turned her away, Isabella Ferraro knew that sometimes life's worst moments could lead to its greatest blessings. That was the end of this story about Isabella Ferraro and Tate Blackwood. Where are you listening from today? If you enjoyed this tale about judging people by their character rather than their appearance, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories like this one. Don't forget to share with your friends and family to help spread kindness and awareness that true worth comes from within. Thank you for listening.